Okay, so welcome everybody to the second Philosophy Matters event from the University Northwest for this semester. I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague Christian Kronsted this evening, and his presentation is entitled Dancing Plague, Crowd Dance and the Loss of Executive Control. Christian, in addition to having a Ph.D. in philosophy and cognitive science from the University of Memphis, is a competitive breakdancer with the Stylin Out Crew in Chicago and the Crew Dynasty in New York City. His work is an exciting interdisciplinary exploration of dance theory, Chicago dance club practice, historical phenomena pertaining to dancing groups, cognitive science, and contemporary philosophy of mind. He is, as you now know, an active performer as well as a theorist, and he was recently honored by the American Society of Aesthetics for his groundbreaking work in this area. In the past year, Christian has published 6 articles on the intersection between what he calls or will describe as 4 E theories of mind: improvisation and communal dance practices, appearing in places such as Contemporary Aesthetics, the Journal of Aesthetic Education, the Journal of Dance Education, and the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness. He co-organized an international conference on dance and embodied cognition with Sean Gallagher this past summer, and is currently working on another to commence soon in New York City as a follow-up. He's also an active member of 2 labs associated with the Institute for Intelligent Systems at the University of Memphis, the Cognitive Computing Research Group, and the Languages Across Cultures Lab. So we really couldn't be more lucky than to have the person who in the country right now is at the greatest cutting edge of this multidisciplinary work with us tonight, sharing, I think, something that's a new kind of set of ideas for him. So we're delighted to invite him with us. Christian will go ahead and present for about 35-40 minutes. As he's about to wrap up, if you have questions, go ahead and type a little Q in the chat box with a very brief indication of what your question might be, and then we'll call on you in order as those come through the chat box queue, and I'll remind you of this as we get a little farther along into the evening. So welcome, Christian, everybody, big round of applause.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share this PowerPoint here. Go up here, and then everybody should be able to see it. And that's a slide too far, so let's go all the way to the beginning here. Okay, so I assume everyone can see my PowerPoint. And of course now I can't see you, but that sounds like a yes. Is that right, Renee?
You're good, Christian.
Okay, great, awesome. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And by the way, if you want to study grit, just go and search up pictures of breakdancing crews, because they're always sort of posting behind railroad tracks or abandoned buildings. So there's plenty for you to go on there. But for now, we're going to talk about dancing plague and crowd dance and the loss of executive control. Renee already gave sort of a nice little introduction, so I'm not going to say much more about myself. Like Renee said, I've been breakdancing since 2005. I have a Ph.D. in philosophy and cognitive science. And I specialize in this weird thing called embodied cognition. Now, in the daytime, I'm currently making lie detectors for the Institute of Intelligent Systems, but I like to mostly think about dance. And so my research is on dance and this thing, embodied cognition. And so just very briefly, we're not going to talk too much about this, but in this perspective, the mind is something that's inactive, right? It's not just in your head, it's something that you do, right? So all thinking is also moving the body. The boundaries of the mind is porous. So, objects that you use every day, like your cell phone, when you're navigating in your car and you can't drive without using Google Maps, that's an example of extended cognition, right? So the mind is porous, it's extended into the environment. The mind is embedded, so it's not just something that happens abstractly up here and then once in a while you get back into the world. Rather, you're already always in some sort of context and you're moving within the world. You're already embedded into an environment, right? So it's very pragmatic. And then, of course, on this kind of view, the body is just equal to the mind, right? So it's the whole body that's thinking. So it's a pretty new and sort of different way of thinking about the mind. And as it turns out, this fits really well with how we think about dance. And so, like I said earlier, even though I'm building lie detectors right now, what I think about in my own research is vernacular dance in particular. So the kind of dances that are not happening on stage, the kind of dance you do in the club or at the corner store or in front of the mirror by yourself, maybe at a ritual or a wedding. It's non-stage dance, and a lot of these dances are improvised, right? So it's really improvised vernacular dance that I'm mostly interested in here. So I want to talk about dancing plague. And so when you say that you work on dance, people do this thing where they send you this one Wikipedia article. Over and over and over, you get this one Wikipedia article, and it's about the dance plague in Strasburg in 1518, right? And every time someone sends this to me, I think, oh, this can't be right. This has to be an urban myth. This has to be a legend. There's no way that this is a real thing. So what happened was that in 1518, this woman walks through the streets of Strasbourg, and she's just really jolly. She's having a good old time, and she's dancing. And all the local so-called peasants around her, they've had a really horrible time. They're sort of living in the midst of Calvinist Europe, right? So joy is forbidden in any shape and form. And then they see this woman having a good time, and she's bouncing. And they decide to join her. And then suddenly more and more people join her. And they say, screw the church, fuck the church, we're going to dance, right? And they dance and they dance and they dance. And of course the church and its authorities come in, and they're standing there and they're thinking, what's going on here? We should probably do an exorcism. This seems like it's demonic possession. We should make them stop. And to their surprise, they found out that the peasants can't stop dancing. They literally cannot stop moving, right? So they keep dancing and it's spreading. And at a certain point, the peasants themselves realize, I can't stop moving. I can't stop moving my body. I've lost the executive control. I've lost the executive ability to override my actions and stop them. And so it becomes this grim, terrible scene where some of them are bashing their skulls against the wall, trying to make themselves pass out. Because if you're dancing and joy is forbidden, then your salvation's at stake. You might not go to heaven if God looked at you and said, oh, wow, he was dancing in the streets. And so a lot of these peasants actually end up knocking themselves out or dying from exhaustion. And so I thought, this can't be right? Like this, there's no way this is a real story. Maybe it's just urban myth. And then let's fast forward, right? Let's flash back to the present here. I'm getting married to the most beautiful woman in the world. I'm very happy. And then the following Wednesday, we're in the kitchen and I'm making food and I'm DJing for my wife, right? And so she's sort of just like dancing around in the living room. And I know that my wife, she has this affinity for Chicago Juke music and Detroit techno. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna play some of that. So maybe a lot of you know this song.
Bounce and break your back, you bounce so hard, you break your back, girl. Bounce and break your back, bounce and break your back, bounce and break your back, you bounce so hard, you break your back, girl. Bounce and break your back, bounce and break your back, bounce and break your back, you bounce so hard, you break your back, girl. Bounce and on it goes. So I'm playing Bounce and Break Your Back, and she's just getting into it there in the living room, right? She's bouncing, she's breaking her back, as they say. It's sort of a grim image, right? Okay, there. Hold on. Let me just make sure I'm sharing again. Am I sharing my screen again?
Not quite yet, Christian.
Oh, sorry. Let's make sure that happens. There, share. Okay, excellent. And so she's dancing, and then about 20 minutes later, dinner is ready, and I say, okay, you can sit down now. It's time to eat. I made all this amazing food because I want to spoil you. And she looks at me and she goes, I can't stop. And I said, what do you mean you can't stop? And then she looks at me and she's panicked and she says, I can't stop dancing. And I say, what do you mean? And she just won't stop dancing. And she says, you have to turn off the music. And so I actually saw it myself with my own eyes, right? She just couldn't stop dancing. And so I thought back to this article that everyone kept sending me about dancing plague and said, okay, maybe there's something to this. And so the very next day, we go and we have dinner with one of my advisors, and we tell him this story, and he said, well, when I was in 6th grade, I had all the kids at my elementary school line up and do a conga line. So we're all walking around in the schoolyard at recess, and we have our hands on our shoulders, and we're dancing and suddenly the kids won't stop dancing. And the teachers couldn't get kids to stop dancing, and eventually they had to wrangle the kids, physically wrangle them apart and put them in separate rooms to make them stop dancing. And so after I heard that story, I was like, okay, maybe I should really look into this. And so let's just start with a quick history of what has turned out to be called in the literature dancing mania. And so it turns out that dance mania or dancing plague or tarantism, it has quite a few names, is quite a common phenomenon once you start looking for it. And so throughout the pre-Christian ancient world, lots of people, they worship Dionysus, which is this sexy centaur kind of god that was also a wine god and a party god. And the way that you would get in contact with the divine is that you would go into the forest or up into the mountains, and you would dance yourself into a frenzy with other people until you passed out from exhaustion. And it turns out that ancient history is full of these accounts of people worshiping Dionysus, going into the forest and just, rocking out until they would pass out. But at a certain point in these rituals, they would get to a point, a critical moment of mass and a critical moment of vibrancy, where executive control would go away, and they could no longer sort of control their movements, or they could no longer stop their movements. And so this particular type of ritual was so powerful that the Roman Empire banned it for quite a while. So Dionysus worship was banned for quite some time. And even the Christian church, when that sort of took over, decided to really shut down these kinds of rituals because they're extremely powerful and they're also egalitarian, right? So men and women would do these together, and you can bypass the authority of the centralized church if the way that you get in contact with the divine is simply through dancing yourself into a frenzy. So furthermore, throughout the ancient world, and we're talking here pre-Christian, there's this particular kind of dance and music called, and I probably pronounced this wrong, the dithyramb. And it would usually be performed in cohort with these ecstatic dances. There are some really interesting sections where both Plato and Aristotle, they're a little bit on the fence about dithyramb. And in the politics, Aristotle actually warns against it, right? It brings out disorderness in the soul. So frenzied dancing apparently leads to a disordered soul. And then as you keep looking more, you find that throughout medieval Europe, it's not just the event of 1518. There were several outbreaks of dancing plague throughout medieval Europe, and the church and local authorities had these different accounts of what you should do as a city administrator if you run into a problem with dancing plague. How do you get the peasants to stop, right? And usually it's sort of a disease of the lower class. So the nobility, for some reason, did not catch this affliction. And we can talk about why that is. But they had all these rules and regulations for what to do. And one of the recommended approaches was to hire musicians and then play more music, which of course didn't make it any better, right? And then people would just go harder, usually until they collapsed. And so there are all these accounts of peasants dancing onto bridges, for example, and then the bridge would collapse and they all fell and died, right? Or like I mentioned earlier, people sort of bashing their heads against the wall. In southern Italy and Spain, there's a long tradition which lives on today called tarantism. And in these parts of the world, it was believed that if you're bitten by the southern European tarantula spider, then you fall into a frenzied state of dancing where you cannot control your own movements and you cannot stop your own movements, which is the important one here, right? We have examined these spiders, and there's no connection between tarantism and the spider bite, but that was sort of the excuse, right? And typically it was women who would fall into the prey of tarantism, but tarantism was also known to be extremely contagious. And so once one person got the spider bite, everybody would just start dancing, and they couldn't stop, right? They would not be able to stop. Carnival is sort of the medieval and Renaissance version of a modern day rave. And there are many accounts also of carnivals being these experiences where people would go in procession together and dance, and then losing this ability to stop what they're doing. I haven't looked too deep into Native American practices yet, just because this is new work that I've just started. but there are several accounts of Native American elders dancing frenziedly, losing the ability to override and stop, and that brings them sort of into contact with something divine, perhaps, that helps with decision making. And then you see this kind of phenomenon also in contemporary American church practice, AME churches, Baptist churches, and all over the world at raves and clubbing. And I think the rave as a phenomenon is really, when you read accounts of raving, is really where this takes place now, right? The difference between something like Dancing Plague and a rave is simply that people go there voluntarily and no one stops them, right? But it seemingly is the same phenomenon, right? Once you get going and you build critical mass, you're unable to stop what you're doing. You see similar cases. So I've talked to people in the Chicago footwork community, in the Chicago house dancing scene, and particularly people who were around early on, and you can read some of their accounts. And there seems to be a similar thing going on there, right? So once you start looking, it turns out that Dancing Plague is everywhere, right? It's not a one-time freak incident. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to use the word tarantism, because Dancing Plague and Dancing Mania has this negative medical connotation that a lot of 17th century and 18th century doctors sort of slapped onto it because they were anti-joy. And so I'm going to go with tarantism here because I think it's slightly more neutral. But we can also talk about if there's a better term. So how do we explain this, right? That's what I wanted to figure out, because now I found out that this is a common phenomenon. I've seen it happen in front of me. How do we explain this seeming loss of executive control? And so we're going to have to talk a whole lot about physics, surprisingly enough. And we're going to have to talk about, and this is quite a mouthful, we're going to talk about self-organizing, self-perpetuating, complex dynamical systems. And then we're going to talk about affordances and how a self-organizing, self-perpetuating, complex dynamical system can emerge as an entity on its own and then have top-down causation onto the agents that are within the system itself. And I'll explain more what that means, right? Because that's quite a mouthful. But essentially what happens is that within these frenzied dance crowds, when they emerge as an entity with emergent properties, within each dancer, so within each agent, there's a change in what's called the sense of agency. So the dancer themselves is no longer aware whether they're originating the movement, or if it's the person next to them, or if it's them together, right? There's a diffusal of what's called the sense of agency. And similarly, and this is the really freaky one, is there's also a diffusal of the sense of ownership. So that means when you're in such a vivid crowd, such a vibrant crowd, you're no longer sure if it's your arm that's moving or if it's the arm of someone else. So there's this experience of becoming a blended agent where you're no longer sure, well, who is actually moving right now, right? Is it me? Is it them? Who's moving? And so when these two senses become diffused, then it's only a one step further to think, okay, well, I can't stop what I'm doing. How would I stop something that I'm not the agent of? How would I stop something that's not even my body? So that's what we're getting to. Right, so I want to start with this concept of affordances. So affordances is a very fancy cognitive science term, but really what it means is something like a possibility for action. So the affordance that I think people are most familiar with is the high five. So I put my hand up, and then that gives you the ability or the possibility to go high five, right? Or I stick out my fist, and that affords you a fist bump, right? I stick out my hand, that affords you a handshake, right? So greetings is a classic notion of affordance. And so we can think about vernacular improvisational dance, like the ones that you're doing when you're raving, for example, as a give and take or an exchange of affordances between the dancers, right? So think about the last time you went to a wedding and you're dancing with your silly uncle, and your silly uncle does the fishing rod, right? He throws the fishing rod and then he does this and he pulls it back in. Well, that gives you an affordance or a possibility to pretend like you're being pulled by the fishing rod, right? So not all dance moves are as clear-cut as the fishing rod, but the idea here in general is that you become more and more in sync as you're exchanging these different possibilities. So each person is providing the other person with possibilities for how to move, right? Now, there's this extremely fascinating thing about human bodies, and this comes back to the whole physics thing again, is that we are very, very, very sensitive to synchronization and resonance. So there are studies from a whole wealth of different fields that demonstrate that the more time we spend together, the more alike we become, or the more in sync we become. So for example, when humans just spend time together in a room, their bodies start to bob at the same rate of synchronization. Your gesture becomes similar, right? Your posture lines up. The way that you track things in the environment with your eyes begins to synchronize. Your heartbeat becomes more similar. Your breathing becomes more similar, right? Even hormone production has been shown to become similar. So the more time you spend with someone in a room, literally the more similar you become, the more you fall into sync with them. There's even research now, there's a whole wealth of research that show that your brain wave patterns, your brain activation actually becomes synchronized, right? So as you're giving and taking affordances, as you're exchanging your affordances, you fall into more and more synchronization, and then more and more synchronization makes it easier to give affordances, right? So you can see there's already a loop there. Synchronization, affordance, affordance, synchronization, boom, boom, boom. And you're doing this in this tightly constrained space with all these other people. Now, there's this thing about affordances is that they're incredibly sensitive to everything that's going on around you, right? So it's not just the dance moves that provide certain kind of affordances, but it's also what the rhythm is like, right? So if it's bounce and break your back, bounce and break your back, I can't believe I'm singing that. But if there's a certain kind of rhythm that affords certain kinds of movements, right? Think about the affect in the room. When you walk into a party and things are really bumping, right? That's a certain kind of vibe or affect in there that will allow you to do certain things that you can't do in a place where there's a different kind of affect, right? You're not going to bump your chest if you're at a funeral. Similarly, the emotion that is provided to you by the people in front of you also tells you something about what you can and cannot do in the space. And then, of course, the physicality of the space itself matters, right? So if you're dancing in a very tightly constrained nightclub, you're not going to be afforded to do these grand old movements because you don't have the space. But there's also other things. For example, if you're dancing in a church, right? The very history of that place and your relationship to it also scaffolds the affordances that you have available. So part of what's going on here is that once you build enough critical mass, once enough people are dancing, well, then the affordances that you are given, right, in the space just tells you to do more dancing. And then as you're doing more dancing, you're providing other people with affordances to do more dancing. And so it becomes this self-enforcing, self-perpetuating feedback loop. So that brings us to this idea of resonance, synchronization, and self-organization, right? So this is all physics, and we see these principles take place across all levels of explanation. So it happens at the level of molecules. It happens at the level of cells. It also happens in schools of fish, in flocks of birds, herds of antelope, people that are marching. And the fascinating thing is that once you have enough agents, and each of these agents are oscillating, all of these different frequencies tend to fall into an automated relationship of organization, right? They do what's called self-organize. And so I'm going to show you a little video here to really understand what it is that I'm talking about. So I'm going to share screen, YouTube, and then we're going to switch to this other video over here. So this is a plate, okay? And it has sand on it. It's just basic sand. And so it's going to be a little bit of an uncomfortable sound, just so you're warned. So this is at a specific frequency.
What is it?
368.
And now we're going to turn up the frequency.
Sprinkle some more on.
Okay, I'm going to turn the sound off, but I'm going to keep going further and further forward. And so what you can see here is that simply putting vibration through the plate makes the sand vibrate, and the vibrations then organizes the sand into very, very complex patterns. Right, so this stuff is pretty amazing. Back to PowerPoint. Okay, and here. So the point is that we see this kind of self-organization across many levels in nature, right? And the place where we see it the most is the brain, right? The brain is sort of a classic example of self-organization where you get these highly complex patterns. Now, there's another really fancy physics thing we need to talk about to understand this phenomenon, and that's the idea of emergence out of complexity. So once you have enough complexity, the entity that comes out of it, right, that emerges, has abilities that is beyond what each of its members, what they have, right? So in other words, you can't reduce a system with a certain level of complexity to the sum of its parts. So the more complexity you get, the more organization you get, the more abilities you get that cannot just be taken apart, all right? And so a new entity emerges out of that. And so think about when you walk into a club or something like that, right? And everything seems to be vibrating. People are bouncing, the music is going, right? There are lights. That becomes sort of a self-organized system. And when you walk in there, right, it feels sort of like it's a thing on its own, right? It sort of is a weird world that you step into. Well, what happens here is that at the level of complexity of the emergent agent, that entity, in this case, let's say at the club, is actually causing something to happen to each of its components, which is, in this case, the dancers, right? In the brain, it would be the emergent level of frequency of activation can then go top down and then affect individual neurons or individual clusters of neuron, which then in turn activates up to the level above it, right? So what's happening here, right, is that the crowd itself as a group, as an emergent entity, will then have an effect on each of the dancers. It'll resonate onto them. And then when you're given that resonance and you receive those affordances, then you act back onto the entity, right? So you're constantly reenacting the experience. And so to put that differently, right, you go into a party and you see a bunch of people having fun, so then you want to have fun, and then as you're having fun, you're reinforcing the fun, right? That's essentially what's happening there. Now, there's this concept of optimal frequency that happens. And so when you have a system that's driving another system, it turns out that within each relationship, you can find an optimal frequency in which the driven oscillates at its maximum capacity, right? And it turns out that with human beings, you can find that too. So human beings have statistically been shown to oscillate the most at 120 beats per minute. And that's roughly where things like house, techno, raving, and breakbeats, that's where they start. But also classic drum music, right? And even some of the drumming music that you will find in sort of scripts for medieval peasant music, things like that. And so there are certain frequencies that we just bounce to more, right? We oscillate at a higher amplitude when we are in contact with those frequencies. And so part of what's going on is that tarantism, this state of losing executive control, is an ideal state in which you're just getting hit with a bunch of optimal frequencies, right? Everything just comes together just right. So the group itself as an emergent entity is resonating onto each of the participants, and then the participants reenact that group. And so the whole experience becomes self-perpetuating. So here's something I want to try out. And again, this is work in progress, right? So I don't want to say that something like social oppression is necessary for reaching the state of tarantism, but I want to say that it's at least a powerful catalyst, because in each case, in each of the historical and contemporary cases that we've looked at, tarantism seems to be brought about because of this need for catharsis, right? So whether it's gender oppression or it's racial oppression or it's labor oppression or whatever kind of oppression this seems to be you're talking about, it seems that participants go and perform these rituals and get into the state to sort of let it all go, right? To experience the state of catharsis. And we have to also remember that the dancing plague, as we started with, it's scary because you're being told to stop, but it's also simultaneously extremely pleasurable, right? There are all of these different hormones and chemicals that are being released into the brain and the body when you're moving and you get into this kind of state, but also moving the body itself repeatedly just feels really good. Now, here's that thing about the sense of agency, right? So phenomenologically speaking, the sense of agency is you being an agent. So in other words, I'm the one who's pushing, right? I'm the one who's originating this push. Now, the sense of ownership is it's happening to me. I am the one being pushed, right? My body is being pushed. So those are two separate kinds of experiences that are sort of latent, or they're pre-reflective in everything that you do, but they can come apart and they can be changed, right? They can be augmented. And so when you read accounts of people that have experienced dance frenzy, right? Or if you just talk to dancers that do a lot of contact improvisation or tango or house, or you find it in things like bachata and salsa and all these different dances, part of what happens, oh, I went too far here. Part of what happens, right, is that they experience this merging together of their agencies, right? So they are no longer aware of, am I starting this movement or are you starting this movement? It's not quite clear who's starting the movement. Maybe it's just the both of us, right? So there's a blending of this sense of agency that happens when you dance with other people. And so part of what's going on in the large crowd that's experiencing this tyrantic state is that all of this resonance and self-organization that I was just talking about enhances this experience of a drift in the sense of agency. Right? And so here's the crazy thing. So a similar thing seems to happen when you read accounts about group dance and you look at the sense of ownership. So a lot of people that do contact improvisation, for example, experience this drift in the sense of ownership, a drift in whose body is it even that's moving, because they get to experience their bodies as being joined. Right? And so the whole idea here is that all of this synchronization and these feedback loops and this resonance that becomes reoccurring leads to a drift in the sense of agency and the sense of ownership. And when you have that drift happen, then at least it feels like you can't stop what you're doing, right? Because how are you going to stop something that you're not the author of? Or how are you going to stop something that's technically not your body? Or at least that's how it's experienced, right? And so we can talk about if there really is a metaphysical difference here between experiencing your body as being unable to stop and not being able to stop, full stop. There probably is. But I think for now, my answer is that this loss of executive control comes from this drift in agency that's being experienced. Okay, so I've talked a lot and very fast, just to stick within a time limit. So I think we should, I would love to chat with you guys and get some feedback, get some questions going. So thank you so much for sticking with me.
Okay, everybody, give Christian a big round of applause. You can do it up in your icons. And we have a nice little run of things happen. We've got 4 questions already in the Q&A, so I'm going to take them just in order. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Daniel, you want to go first?
So I have a question. The type of music that's happening now is a bunch of people in a group listening to music with headphones, but without any outside music. Would that relate to this kind of Tarnanta's theme or no?
Oh, so are you talking about when people do silent discos?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's really interesting. So in principle, right, in a silent disco, you're supposed to all listen to the same thing at the same time. It doesn't always sync up a little bit. And so my hunch is telling me here that because there's a little bit of lag in the sync in a silent disco, it might be that you don't get the same kind of powerful level of self-organization or synchronization, just because there seems to be a disconnect between what you're doing and the person next to you is doing, in a way that when you're all hearing the same thing, you can re-synchronize yourselves repeatedly. But this doesn't seem like you can do that as well in a silent disco, which is partially why they're so awkward, right? They're awkward to look at from the outside, but they're also kind of awkward to do. And I think the story gets even worse when you're listening to different things, because then you just got a bunch of people sort of moving in sync with what they're hearing, but not with each other. And so that can feel sort of, what's that word? Like a cacophony, right? It's and so I think silent discos would be a really great experiment to set that up and see if you can get that same kind of state. Because I think if you're listening to something different and you're mainly synchronizing with what's in your own headphones, you're sort of moving against synchronizing with the crowd as a whole. So that's a really interesting case. Thank you. Oh, Renee, you're muted.
So we're going to move on to Dee's question, and Dee, I'm going to let you ask it, but I can anticipate that Christian will have a good deal to say about it, just having read it. So go ahead, Dee.
Hey, Christian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So you touched really briefly on the church, but when you started talking, I was thinking that it sounds like, you know, what we would refer to as like catching the Holy Ghost, like in a Baptist church. And I was just wondering if there's any, you know, synchronicity there, if that might be, you know, part of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So there was a little bit of lag in the call here, but I think what you're asking me is about if there's similar synchronicity that happens in Baptist churches and things like that. And yes, absolutely, right? This notion of catching the Holy Ghost, you actually, interestingly enough, also find that in house culture and in rave culture. There are different versions of it, but it is sort of a similar thing, right? So if you get people to fall into high enough levels of alignment and high enough levels of synchronization, then you can make them do things or experience things that are seemingly outside of their own agency, right? So when you see people catch the Holy Ghost, especially on YouTube, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff before it that you didn't see in the YouTube clip, or maybe you saw the whole thing if they filmed the whole thing, right? But there's all sorts of like preaching, which is usually repeated, right? There's a certain kind of rhythm that comes with these kinds of preachings, right? There's a lot of repetition, and so that makes the people that are watching the sermon fall into higher and higher degrees of synchronization. So I want to say it's very similar, right? Like I think you're spot on there, that's the same kind of mechanism, which is also why sometimes you have people in congregations talk about how they experience sort of a communal feeling of becoming one, right? And usually this feeling of becoming one is sort of associated with the divine, right? And part of what's going on there is that moving in synchrony with other people causes this kind of drift in your experience of self, right? Like you start to get some sort of weird joint experience of self, right? So you see it a lot in church congregations. You see a lot of different types of dance, right? I believe both Weber and Durkheim talk about this kind of collective effervescence. So it's a very common phenomenon, and I think that it's very similar, yeah.
This is great. And Christian is just too humble to tell you that he's recently had a paper entitled Catching the Ghost. So one of those publications from last year that is available in an online journal, Contemporary Aesthetics, I can send you all the link if you're interested, doesn't speak to this particular version of it, but speaks to the phenomenon in general. So Dee, you're right in the zone with Christian today. Mia, how about you next?
Okay, I guess the question is to kind of piggyback off of what you just explained. And then the previous question, it's when you were talking about synchronization and like affordance and resonance. And like in 1518, when that woman was dancing, I mean, I'm sure there wasn't music that they could all listen to. I think the question is, how did they all sync up? Because I can go into Walmart in a certain neighborhood and I can see that, you know, your local crackhead on the street just dancing, and it's not making me have the urge to, oh, like, let me dance, you know, with them. I think what I'm asking is how is that, especially without the frequencies, how do you get a mass majority of people to be in sync without the frequencies? And then what's the difference between me just seeing a random guy at the bus stop or at Walmart dancing and not having that urge to
Yeah.
want to join?
Excellent question. That is really good. So when you read some of these accounts of what happened in 1518, right, we have to remember that in this particular moment in time, so the Calvinist version of the church has put a ban on every and all kinds of enjoyment, right? I mean, you are just, as a regular medieval person, you are not allowed to have fun because then you don't go to heaven, right? And so there's a very large amount of repression that's happening in this time period, right? And so human beings in general, we have this very, very deep tendency to mimic other people, right? And that it happens automatically. So usually when I do a talk in person, right? And this comes back to this whole synchrony thing. Usually when I do a talk in person, I will say, oh, look around you in the room right now. And then you'll notice that most people actually sit more or less the same way, right? So this doesn't happen on Zoom, right? Which is part of why Zoom is weird. But usually if you're in a room together, if one person starts sitting like you're sitting right now, most people would just like slowly sit in some version of that, right? And so there's a certain kind of social contagion where you just become more like other people just by spending time with them doing the same activity, right? So, and there's a bunch of research that goes back to prehistoric human beings and what's called grooming practices, where becoming more alike when you're grooming, for example, creates more cohesion, right? So evolutionarily speaking, it goes all the way back to prehistoric humans. This mechanism to become more alike, right? So the first point of the puzzle here to your question is that people were very, very repressed. And then we have this automatic mechanism to mimic each other. And then I'm sure you can imagine if you're really repressed and you just really want to have some fun, right? And then this person is doing something that's really driving you to mimic them, right? Because movement itself promotes mimicry. Then you get the mechanism going, right? And there's also a couple of things that, you know, when you look into this stuff, is that it's not like this one person had lost the moment of executive control, or the ability to executive control herself, and then immediately everybody else also lost it, right? It wasn't until they had built up a certain amount of critical mass and they were all bopping together that they started realizing that they couldn't stop. It wasn't until there was a problem that it was a problem, right? And so it could be that the first part of the process is just people wanting to do it. And then the second part of it is, now I can't stop doing it, right? So again, if you think about, you walk into a party and then the dance floor is empty, someone has to be the first one and someone has to be the second one. And then usually it builds from there, right? And so usually also what happened in these cases of dancing plague is that eventually the church would come and put music on, which just made it so much more work, which is so much worse, right? So if this person was singing and maybe bopping or something, that was sort of enough to get it going. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question.
So in the queue right now, I've got Kitsali. I want Rochelle to go ahead and make her comment because that's pretty cute. And we should develop it a little bit. And then David, I can have you in the queue after that. And I also invite other students to be responsive to previous questions or anything else from the talk. And there goes one from Jacob. So David and then Jake. Actually, David, I'm going to keep you last. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So it'll be after Rochelle, Jacob, but now Kitsali.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so my question was, you mentioned the story with your wife, so you will not need a dance partner. And I think I will leave the only good music part out because like in the previous question, you guys like talked about how like the music didn't come until later, but everyone like still synchronized with each other.
Mm-hmm.
But so I just thought it was very like interesting how I think you said that your wife was dancing by herself.
Mm-hmm.
That she synchronized with the rhythm of the music, or like I just feel like if that's as likely to happen as an entire like as to when a group would do it.
Yeah. So the case with my wife that really brought me onto this whole experience, to this whole research, right, was kind of weird because I was cooking, right, and so the most I was doing was sort of bopping, right. I too love Detroit techno and Juke music, right. So I was probably like bopping a little bit, right? But she was mostly synchronizing with this music, and then a little bit with me behind the counter. We sort of we had a kitchen island in that apartment. And part of what's going on there, I think, is that I talked a little bit in the talk about optimal frequency, right? So there are just certain kind of frequencies that will make you oscillate more, right? And so for human beings in general, for example, with beats, it's 120 beats per minute, roughly. And then there are certain frequencies of bass, lower frequencies, that actually tend to make us bop more, right? And those are typically the elements that are in electronic dance music, which is, really interesting because that sort of fits with why it's so popular. But I think part of what's going on here is that these rare cases, right? Because tarantism is pretty rare, right? It's not something that happens every time you go dancing, right? It's still sort of a unique. That's why not everyone can tell that story about their partner, right? But I think maybe this was sort of one of those moments where you just get it just right? Like you get the frequencies fall into place. Maybe this is also the kind of music that she loves the most, right? And so it makes her oscillate more, right? And perhaps she had a shitty day at work. So there was sort of a kind of catharsis going on there with like dancing it out, right? And so I think if you hit the right elements, there's a couple of elements you can be without and then add them in later, if that makes sense.
Okay, so Rochelle, did you want to say a little something about everyone's favorite Kevin Bacon movie?
I actually just thought about Footloose when I seen it, but there's a lot of other movies too. There's like I think back with like the Bohemian Rhapsody when they're sitting in the car and they're like, oh, I could see it happening a lot. What I don't, I guess what I'm not understanding is music and dancing has always been around. I mean, it's been around in all different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
It's been done for spiritual healing. You look at poorer countries and you see children in the streets dancing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, like, even like in the office, we've had office staff say, can we just have music? I mean, music in the office helps us work faster.
Right.
So I don't understand where the repression is coming from. Is it just from religion?
Okay. Yeah. So I think there's two. So thank you for that. I haven't seen Footloose, which I probably should, but I've seen House Party and Beat Street, right? But I think there's two things going on here, right? So the repression part is just that, as the meme says, we live in a society, and he does this in the meme, right? We live in a society, and so usually being in some sort of society is going to create some form of oppression, unfortunately. And so people need a break for that, and it just so happens that dancing yourself into a frenzy releases a whole bunch of very happy chemicals in the body, right? And as you said yourself, you can sort of get in contact with something, right? But the other part of it is that you said, why do we do it all over the world at all times for the sake of healing, no matter what kind of condition that we're in, right? Because dance is really in terms of metabolism, dance is very expensive, right? So it's weird that our ancestors would do this, thousands and thousands of years ago. But part of this is it goes back to this idea of grooming practices, right? So prehistoric humans sitting together, grooming each other. And then as they move into bigger and bigger groups, they need to be further and further apart from each other, right? And so you can mimic the movements of grooming, right, over distances by simply making them better and bigger, right? And then the people over here who are sitting in a group of three and the people over there, prehistoric humans sitting in a group of three, can see that you're doing the same movement you would be doing if you were up close and grooming them. And so moving your body together facilitates the experience of a much larger human group, right? And so if you go with this hypothesis, at least, then dance is the first original group love language, right? And you can sort of trace it back to these very ancient human forms of taking care of each other. And so it's deeply ingrained in us that part of how we love each other and take care of each other happens through synchronized movement, right? It goes all the way back. And so I think part of why it's universal is because it's so deeply ingrained in us, right? And that's why you see it even in cultures where, you know, you could spend your time trying to, I don't know, do something that gets you out of the particular situation that you're in, right? You can always find something else to do, but we spend time dancing, right? And part of that is because it's a love language, right? Does that answer your question?
It does, yes, thank you.
Okay, Jacob, you are up.
Okay, so I've kind of got a bit of a two-parter. So I had the thought, you know, could you intentionally try to induce tarantism? And so then thinking about that, I was thinking, well, now that knowing what it is, would that prevent it from happening even more? So like, you know, a crowd in a rave, if those people knew about the dancing plague and knew what caused it, or at least they, you know, knew what caused them to lose the executive function, would that prevent it from happening?
Okay, so question one, can you induce it on purpose? And question two, can it happen if you know about it? Sounds right? Okay, good. So to your first question, can you induce it? I think you can, right? So I don't know where everyone is located, but just Saturday, I went to a dance event at Columbia College here in Chicago, and they run this event series called the B series because they have a hip hop studies minor there. And so part of what they were trying to make their students do was to get into these dance circles and have them have this kind of ecstatic joint experience, right? And they were very much telling the students, this is what we're trying to do, right? And did anyone go to this just by chance? Was anyone there other than me? Okay. It was a great event, right? But they actually induced it, right? And so I think they got close because there was a certain part where they also had a dance competition, right? And so they had like top 32 or whatever, and then they had a little dance cipher in between, and then they were supposed to go to top 16, and they couldn't really get people to sit down, right? So I think it can be induced, right? When you look at some of the work that I did with house dancers, for example, from the Bay Area scene, a lot of them chase this deliberately, right? It goes back to that catching the ghost thing. So they chase these kinds of experiences, right? And they're very deliberate about it, but that doesn't mean that you can't bring it about. So yeah, I think it can very much be induced, right? Even if you know about it, right? It's the same thing with certain kinds of states in sports, right? When people talk about getting in the zone, and you have your coach trying to explain it to you, and you study it, and it doesn't stop you from getting into the zone, right? What stops you is maybe if you think too hard about it, right? Where you should let it happen, right? But just the fact that you know that it exists shouldn't necessarily stop you. But I think that's a really excellent question. I was asked one time, I gave another talk, and there's sort of a kind of a similar topic, right? About synchronization. And someone asked me if we could weaponize this. I said, I don't know, I don't want to think about that, but people have thought about it, right? So yeah, it can definitely be induced.
Good. So Sarah says she didn't at the time have a question, but she's fascinated. Sarah, did you want to make a comment, or do you want us just to take the other questions?
So I just really wanted to say that I was really fascinated with it, and I kind of actually thought of a question. I don't know if you have the answer for it, but it's a curiosity on my part of the phenomenon of not being able to stop dancing. Do you know what like the longest somebody's danced for before like they were able to stop?
So like a Guinness World Record kind of thing. So I'm not sure if there's like a record, right? But what they did with some of these medieval incidents, let's call them that, is that they would just have people dance until they dropped. And so some people would go 48 hours, maybe 3 days, and then they died from exhaustion, right? It's really sort of grim. But so I would say that, I mean, you can probably do it for a couple of days if it's the end you have in mind, right?
So
Yeah,
I'm
go
not,
ahead.
well, I'm gonna have to look it up, Sarah. Before this, I was thinking about a different but related phenomenon of dance marathons that used to happen in the Depression era. Now they did get to have some sustenance and go to the bathroom. They weren't allowed to go to sleep though. And the longest ones went on for about 3 weeks. So apparently there were ways of, and I wanted to ask Christian how we might explain how people could do that even in this environment that's quite different, where you're not trying to vibe with others and you're actually trying to compete with them for a prize. So Sarah, I'm gonna have to look up the final answer, but I've seen if you get a little break for a glass of water every now and again, multiple weeks, I guess is possible. Crazy. Andrea. Oh, sorry, Andrea. Yeah.
Well, he did answer the first part,
Okay.
and he mentioned that some drop to the floor or just, can't.
Okay.
And my second question was, what happened to those people who broke those norms? And
Yeah.
what were the consequences that they had to face?
Right. So I'm still reading into all of this stuff, right? But there seem to have been a few different responses. One of them was to perform a good old exorcism, right? And make sure that, the demon had left them. But it really depends on where you're looking, right? So there are certain religious, so for example, if you go with the Dionysus example, right? Those people would just go back to work, go back to whatever they were doing after they woke up from their dance-induced coma, right? Because that was considered part of the ritual. And so I think for, the very punitive medieval Europe case, I could imagine some people might got burned on the stake and other people might have been imprisoned, or maybe some people would just get sent back to work in the fields or whatever. But that is a good question. In a lot of cases where it's voluntary, where it's self-induced, people will just go back to doing whatever it is that they're doing with their lives, but in a refreshed manner, right? I mean, part of this is that it's sort of a cleansing experience. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's cleansing if it doesn't go on too long, right, Christian?
Yeah.
Sierra, I think you are up next.
Hi, I just had a question. Does location have anything to do with when a dance frenzy can occur? Because say I'm driving and my friend has music going, I can't really dance, because I'm driving and worried about the semis around me, Does location really affect when a dance frenzy can occur?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it yourself. You can't do it when you're driving, right? Because there's a certain kind of physicality to it. I could imagine that maybe something like being unable to stop bopping if they're, going on the Spotify really well could potentially occur, right? But I think the environment itself is really, really important for what it is that's going on here. So there's a reason why, nightclubs have lights, right? Or where they have light up floors or whatever it is, right? So yeah, there are absolutely certain kinds of constraints that the physical environment itself puts on you. But there are also other, more, let's say, normative aspects, narrative aspects. So I would find it very puzzling if in, let's say, Denmark, where I'm from, right? If there was a dance frenzy that occurred at a funeral, right? Because that's just not the kind of space where there's the affect for it, or where people go in with some sort of expectation to even being remotely able to move, right? So I think there are all sorts of place-making factors that go into this, right? It looks like you're in an office right now, maybe, and so maybe there's some freak occurrence where a dance mania could break out into the office, right? If you all said, we've had enough and we're gonna bargain for better wages at the university or whatever it is, right? And we're gonna do it with a dance plague. But but I think the context matters quite a bit.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to let Dr. Detmer go now. If there are any other student questions, anyone who has not asked a question yet would get first priority, but anyone who has asked a question and would like to do a follow-up, we'll probably have time for just a couple of those before we wrap up. So David, take it away.
Well, thank you. Christian, I really enjoyed your talk. I noticed at one point you used the word phenomenologically, and I'm curious whether the writings of any of the phenomenologists have influenced your project, because I'm thinking of, Husserl, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, wrote extensively about embodiment, and I think some of that might be useful to what you're doing. But I guess I'm not thinking of any particular passages or anything like that, but I'm just curious whether that's part of your research or not.
Yeah, and no, it's definitely going to be, right? I think Merleau-Ponty sort of is the saint here. He's the savior, because he does talk so much about the body, and he has this really great passage where he talks about playing football and how the soccer field, the football, he's in Europe, right? How the football field itself is sort of laden with meaning, and it becomes its own environment, and you can sort of see the lines of meaning as you're moving through it. And so I think he in particular is that's a very fruitful place to go. And then there are some of the sort of currently living phenomenologists that talk about the sense of agency and the sense of ownership that I've been looking to, but they're all that's all Merleau-Ponty that they start with, right? So yeah, he's definitely going to be in there. And I actually have it sitting. I have it sitting right here on my desk, right? So I need to sort of scour through it to see if there's any moment in which he talks about sort of letting go in any way. So if I don't know, do you know a lot of Merleau-Ponty? Because I would love the help.
Yeah.
Okay, I would love the help. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, I was just going to say one other thing really quickly, since you mentioned football, or what we in the US call soccer.
Soccer, yeah.
In Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, there's a rare comic sentence in his work, because he has this extraordinary long and torturous analysis of soccer. And after going through 20 or 30 pages of this, he suddenly says, but then everything is complicated by the presence of the other team.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think I need to look at that too, if for anything, just for the sassiness of it, right? But yeah, Merleau-Ponty is definitely the place to go, I think.
Great. So any other students with particular questions, follow-ups, comments? Daniel, I think we've traveled the world with you, I have to say. Thank you for sticking with us on screen the whole time. That's been absolutely great. And I would ask questions, but Christian knows I probably have 30 for him. So,
yeah.
So the one that I will just sort of leave the group with, because I mentioned it earlier, is this question about how you might interpret some of the phenomena of the dance marathons in light of some of these considerations. So let's suppose I give you everything about your account. You know I'm not going to, but let's suppose I do. Then I want to know, okay, could this explain why, in part, the dance marathons went on as long as they did in these cases where they went on for weeks and weeks and weeks? Because even though I really want you to drop so I can win the prize, once we all start working together in a room in this way, doing the same thing, we take on some component of the environment that's self-reinforcing in a cycle that we can't break. And so it just lasts way longer than any of us wanted, because I wanted the person in 24 hours and not 3 weeks later. I don't know if that would help with those cases, but they might be interesting alternatives.
Absolutely.
Because it does seem like in those cases, one thing that would be interestingly different is I wouldn't be looking for a change in my agency. I do want to own everything I'm doing as mine, right? Not like I got lucky and was able to keep on dancing because it was actually that I was part of a group where your affordance permitted me, because then like, what, did I have to share the prize with you? No, right? So I just think it could be a really interesting side case to consider. Maybe also analogous versions like maypole dances, where the goal is to keep the dance going as long as possible till you get the last person standing and she's the queen.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Because there's something interesting about the antagonistic relationship there, where that kind of relationship usually makes people synchronize less, right? So there's all these studies on how couples, for example, when they argue, they fall out of sync, right? And so I think that would be really interesting to look at, right? Because like you said yourself, I don't want to vibe with you. I don't want to, take your affordances, right? Because we're technically against each other, right? And so, yeah, it would be also interesting to see if you can undermine each other. But I think there's sort of a level of unwillingness, right? Where, whether you want to or not, you're going to synchronize, right? Because that's unfortunately just how we're biologically built at this point. And so, you step out, you get your glass of water, and you step back into, and you still all have to dance to the same beat. And so the fact that you're dancing to the same beat just makes you fall back into sync, even if you're sort of at an arm's length of some of these people, right? So I think it can definitely help with that kind of explanation.
Also, it seems like the more tired you get, the more likely you would be to fall into a synchronicity trap, if that's what it would, if you were trying to avoid it in this case, right?
Yeah, right, because this could be a little bit what cyclists, they do when they go in those big trains of cyclists for Tour de France or whatever. Once they get really tired, they start riding behind each other, they use each other. So if you're really exhausted, you just have to keep going, right? It eases up the task of dancing when you're in higher levels of sync, right? So I think there's definitely something there, and I'm going to take a note to look into these.
Well, I think you should watch the Jane Fonda movie, was nominated for lots of Academy Awards. They shoot horses, don't they? Based on a 1935 novel. You might enjoy that.
Okay, and Footloose.
And Footloose, yeah.
Yeah.
You should finish us off for the day.
Oh, can you hear me already?
Yeah, you're good.
Oh, I thought I was muted. Well, so first, definitely watch Footloose, but so I'm not sure, how much you know about this, but it popped into my head. Where would psychedelics have been, or where would they fit in? Like, would they help induce something like that or not? Because I don't know, I just think those kinds of drugs tend to come to mind when you think of people constantly dancing until they drop,
Yeah, so it really depends on the drug, right? So now it's going to sound like I've been doing a whole bunch of drugs, which I haven't, unfortunately. I'm very boringly clean cut, but so for example, if you look at the party scene in New York City in the 80s, right, the drug of choice was cocaine, right? And that gives you a lot of energy, and so it helps in the sense that you can keep going because you ignore your own needs, right? But there are other drugs like DMT, for example. A lot of people that take DMT, they report at least sort of this experience of melting together with other people and physical objects, right? You get all those jokes about I'm a couch, right? And the person is sort of like touching the couch all weirdly. And so I guess it really depends on what kind of drugs it is that you're pumping, right? So I think most drugs will probably help in some capacity, except you probably don't want to go to a dance marathon and smoke pot because that makes you slower, right? Just like you might not want to be drunk, right? Because it makes you uncoordinated and it's actually a depressant. And it takes a lot of energy to be drunk versus other kinds of psychedelics. But I think there is a reason why these communities, they have their drug of choice, right? Because it does help facilitate these processes.
Or as we learned I learned when I had the chance to talk about Christian's work on house dance this past year, that particular community is actually very anti-anything, any anti-intoxicants of any kind, because they want to bring about that experience through a very sort of purely person-to-person interaction. So I'm not sure that you would want to associate intoxicants of any kind with this phenomenon.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, right? A lot of these communities are surprisingly clean cut, right? You find that with house, you find it with trance, you find it with breakdancing, right? A lot of them are just sort of very purist because they can get to it through the dance itself, and so they don't actually need it, right?
So I think we're all going to either dance or watch Footloose tonight. For all of you in the room, I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow. And before you go, please give Christian a really big round of applause. Thank you so much, Christian, for a fantastic
Thank you.
talk.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Daniel Clemens, for staying with us and applauding. Okay, folks, we'll see you soon. And Christian, did you want to hang in for just a minute?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm going to stop recording now.